Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
All right, so we're here today recording with Dr. Chris Moorman, who's a professor at North Carolina State University. And he's got extensive experience researching both game and non-game species, with a significant amount of that research focusing on birds, including turkeys. Glad to have you here with us today, Chris.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Chris, it's great to see you. For the audience out there, you may not be aware of it, but I got my PhD at North Carolina State University, and Chris Moorman was one of my advisors for that work. So good to see you, Chris.
Yes, and Marcus has made me famous with all his productivity. Much appreciated.
Chris, was Marcus always the model student that we think he was?
Marcus could stay up all night and work all day. Let's say that.
Was that work always? Was that work always productive, or?
Not always productive, but when he was productive, he was very productive. So it made up for the times maybe he wasn't productive.
Fair enough.
Yeah, basically there was kind of a hole in my year from about mid-April through mid-May where I was not as productive as other times of the year.
That's true.
So, Chris, one of the things we wanted to have you on to talk about today was the research that you've got going on in North Carolina right now. Can you give us a little bit of information on how that project came to be and what you guys are trying to accomplish?
Sure. So we initiated a project with the state of North Carolina with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission back in late 2019. This is a huge project. The project involves collaborators at NC State University, Dr. Christian Pacifica, and then a collaborator at Louisiana State University, Dr. Brett Collier. We have a PhD student that's leading the project, David Mosicki. The project is funded by the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, I mentioned, and also the National Wild Turkey Federation, especially the Turkey Federation's North Carolina State chapter.
Oh, cool.
We've had a whole bunch of technicians, as you would expect with any of these projects. And what's sort of unique with this project is we're actually doing sort of 3 projects concurrently. So we are studying wild turkey ecology in the coast, in the Piedmont physiographic region of North Carolina, which is central North Carolina, and the mountains concurrently. So with these 3 projects, we can sort of compare regional differences in ecology. Another unique aspect of the project is it's entirely on private properties. Mm. So we have approximately 200 different landowners we're working with, and we have trapped on approximately 24,000 acres of private land. So 200 different private landowners on approximately 24,000 acres of private land.
Wow.
So that's a complicated project, and it's unique in that we're seeing what turkeys are like on private lands, which is a majority of the land area in the southeastern U.S.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That first of all, kudos for you guys and all the collaborators for putting that together. That's pretty impressive, and also that's something that we have talked about before on the podcast, and I've certainly talked to a bunch of people about it personally. A lot of our work has focused on public land because of the nature of the funding and that, but the reality is in North Carolina and much of the rest of the South, a lot of the turkeys actually live on private land, and we don't have as much information directly relevant. So really glad that you guys were able to accomplish this study. That's really awesome.
Yeah, and so we do have that. We are able to address that private land issue, and across 3 regions that are quite different. In the coastal plain, the landscape's dominated by row crop agriculture and hog farming largely. Our Piedmont is more of a managed forest landscape that includes some areas of longleaf pine community restoration, and those landowners tend to have a different sort of stewardship ethic, and they often are interested in managing land for wildlife conservation and for hunting. The mountains is an intermix of closed canopy forest and pasture. A lot of the forest there is not managed. And then there are some public properties that are intermixed. Even though we're trapping our turkeys on private land, sometimes they move on to public lands, the national forest.
Yeah.
So we finished our third year of field work last year. So we're done with our 3 years of field work, and now we're in the analysis phase. We did the standard approach to turkey research. We trapped turkeys using rocket nets over bait. Sometimes it worked well, and sometimes it didn't. Trapping turkeys can be very frustrating and very rewarding. When you get a net over a bunch of turkeys, it's one of the most exciting things in the world. But when you sit there for hours and days on end and the turkeys don't come to bait, or they stay just outside the range of the net, very frustrating. So our first year in the coastal plain, we would see huge groups of turkeys in the fields where we were trapping, 50, 60, 70 birds in a flock, and we couldn't catch them. So we tried everything. We typically would use cracked corn, but we said, let's try soybeans. Soybeans didn't work. So we even tried mealworms, and we may be the only.
I've been there.
Have you tried mealworms?
I have.
Okay. That's a very expensive bait. Let me tell you, and it didn't make a difference.
Were they dry or they were?
Yeah, they're like the ones we used anyway. They were like dehydrated.
Yeah, dehydrated mealworms.
Yeah.
Well, I was with a student and their advisor yesterday, and we were talking about another project, and it's a songbird project. I'm just affiliated as a committee member, but they asked that question. She was like, "Wait, did you put the dry worms in the feeders or the live ones?" And I was like, "Wait, you can buy the live ones? I didn't even know you could get that." So apparently you have to go to the reptile store to get the live ones.
Yes, those would be even more expensive. Chris, have you tried decoys yet?
No.
So we even toyed earlier this year. We were having a lot of problems with capture, and we were toying with the idea of trying out decoys. And one of my grad students said, "Hey, I've got this Avian X hen decoy. I think it's high enough quality that it'll fool the hens long enough that we can get a net over them. But I have some concerns about, the whole net deployment and everything like that, potentially destroying my decoy." He said, "Would you buy me a new one if I did?" This is what grad students that are turkey hunters think about, right?
Yeah.
And I said, "Kevin,
I don't want to tear up my decoys."
I said, "Kevin, if you tear up your Avian X decoy, I will buy you whatever decoy you want if you catch turkeys."
Yeah.
That's a drop
you
in
the ocean in terms of money.
That seems like a really good use of your funds to replace a decoy. Think about, this is one thing that has been striking to me in trying to capture deer and turkeys. You talk to hunters and they're like, "Oh man, like that's got to be easy." And it's like, no, we're all hunters here, and this can be really challenging to catch animals. It's just not the same, as what you're experiencing hunting. And I don't think people really appreciate that. And I didn't. Me individually, I did not appreciate that until I was at Fort Bragg trying to catch deer. Right. And then it was like, I've killed a whole bunch of deer with a bow, but shooting them with a dart gun is a completely different thing.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So same with turkeys, trying to get them under that net. That can be really challenging, and they do not always cooperate.
Yeah, and we're trying to live capture an animal and tag it and release it in a very in excellent condition. So you're thinking about the condition of the animal when you're doing all that sort of trapping.
Yeah. I mean, I guess while we're on this topic, just to kind of relate to the listeners, one of the biggest challenges we face with turkey trapping is you can't shoot over them when they're wet, because it'll pull a lot of feathers out and could potentially lead to them dying of exposure. And then the other thing too is once we start getting into the 70s, as far as ambient air temperature, especially in the 80s, you risk a lot of those birds overheating and dying. So that already puts a lot of constraints on the number of days that you have available to trap, especially here in the South.
Well, and that's something that was a real challenge for our Osceola work when we were trapping, and it didn't really resonate with me until we were sitting there in a blind trying to get them under a net. I mean, keeping the temperature in South Florida below that, even during the winter, that's not that many days.
No.
Right.
We didn't, we had a really narrow window between the hunting seasons where we could capture them, and then a very narrow window on top of that when it wasn't raining and it was also cool enough that you don't risk the animal, from overheating. So, real challenge.
Yeah, the most frustrating thing to me is not trapping when it's raining because those flocks just love to come out in the fields
Yes,
when
yes.
it's raining, and you just have to shut it down.
Yep, yep. Been there. I know Chris has.
Well, we caught a lot of birds. No matter with all the challenges we caught. We caught over 700 birds over those 3 years across the state.
Wow,
And
great sample size.
yeah, we trapped and tagged over 700 birds. About 2/3 of those were hens, adult females, and a third were adult males. We tried to limit our numbers of juvenile individuals to less than 25% of the sample. So when we would get to close to 25% of Jakes and Jennies, we would focus more on the adults. Um, so we put VHF, very high frequency transmitters, on the males because we were less interested in their movements. We were just interested in their survival and
Hmm.
the things that killed adult males. The females got global GPS transmitters that allowed us to track their movements. And those also have the VHF component so we can actually track right into them.
Mm-hmm.
The GPS was really important because it allowed us to identify when the turkeys were nesting and where they were nesting. And so we could wait until they moved off the nesting, monitoring that GPS data, and then we could go in and look at whether the nest was successful or failed. And
So,
that the ultimate goal of the project, sort of the main goal of why the project was funded, is our state agency is very interested in looking at the timing of nesting and how that matches up with the timing of gobbling chronology and how all that plays into the timing of their seasons.
mm-hmm,
Um, so North Carolina is a long, skinny state that goes from the coast to the mountains. So elevation ranges from essentially right at sea level all the way up to over 5,000 feet in
mm-hmm,
elevation. So the sort of I want to say the paradigm is that turkeys in the eastern part of the state nest much earlier than the turkeys in the mountains because they're lower elevation and green up is earlier and sort of the spring starts earlier. So you would presume that the nesting chronology is much earlier in the coastal plain. Yet
mm-hmm.
North Carolina's season is a statewide season. So
Yeah.
everybody hunts turkeys at the same time. So there's a lot of complaints about that the season should start earlier in the coastal plain. And what we found over the 3 years is that the nesting chronology is almost identical.
Oh,
So the
wow.
turkeys in the mountains at 4,000 feet in elevation are nesting at the same time the turkeys in the coast are nesting. And in fact, our first year, those mountain turkeys started nesting a couple of days earlier on average.
Wow.
So, w-
So it's not elevation, it's not the timing of green up that appears to be driving the chronology of nesting. It's latitude and it's the photo
mm-hmm.
period. So it's the day, it's the timing of day and night that keys these birds to start their reproductive activities. And
Yeah,
North
that's
Carolina's
really
at the same
interesting.
latitude
Mm-hmm.
from the mountains to the coast, so it makes sense they're all going at the same time.
Yeah. I was kind of curious to see what you were going to say because I wasn't sure. I
Yeah, I
knew,
wasn't sure either when we started
yeah, I
the
know,
project.
it's a proximate and ultimate Q thing, but I wasn't sure how much green up would have influenced the Q for day length for
Yeah.
them to key in on. So that's really interesting. Well, Chris, you kind of laid out what the objectives were of the study and why it was commissioned, but I was wanting to take a step back from that and ask you another question. There's been a lot of concern with turkey populations in many states. What does the population trajectory look like based on the data that you guys have from the various sources? What does the population trajectory look like in North Carolina?
The population of North Carolina, based on hunter harvest, is stable. We've had the over the past 5 years in North Carolina, several of the years have set all time harvest records. So the population in North Carolina is doing well.
Hmm.
It's robust. It's stable. Harvest is not declining. I think if you talk to our state turkey biologist, Hannah Plumpton, or our previous turkey biologist, Chris Cray, who are very important collaborators in our ongoing research and who know more about turkeys in North Carolina than anybody, they would tell you there are places in the state that show some trends of potential decline, especially in terms of reproduction.
Hmm.
So that you might see reduced numbers of poults per hens in our our statewide survey in some parts of the state and not so in others. Portions of the mountains have had some indication that there could be declines based on reduced reproduction, but the coastal plain tends to have very robust reproduction. It varies from year to year. I can tell you, something else that I think is important for me to highlight as part of our study is that we did locate nests. We tracked those nests for survival, and then we also tracked the broods for those nests that were successful. We found over 400 turkey nests in North Carolina over our 3 years, and the average nest survival over those 3 years is about 25%. So, that's the average. The first year was 16%. The second year was 30, and the third year was 25. So there's lots of ups and downs.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting about that first year, we had 16% nest survival, and then we had 0% brood survival. And we located 106 nests that first year. So of 106 nests that were initiated in North Carolina in our study, there was zero reproduction. Now, Chris Cray always reminds me that there were juvenile turkeys on the landscape the following year. So obviously there was some reproduction, but in our sample, there was 0% reproduction that first year. But the next year was really good.
Did you say, were you tagging the poults or were you
No,
doing something?
we don't tag the poults. We
Were
only
you doing a
monitor the
brood
broods.
flush?
So we have a 3 to 5 day monitoring schedule to monitor the broods. And our determination of success of the brood is at least one poult survives to 28 days.
Okay, and you're determining that by going and finding the hen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Chris, one of the things that we've been talking about a lot on this podcast is that there's been some recent data come out, including data from Dr. Craig Harper's study in Tennessee that shows that there's single-digit proportions of the landscape that have, this quality nesting and brooding habitat. And you just mentioned that, I believe you said that the populations in the coastal plain of North Carolina were doing a little bit better than those in the Piedmont and the mountains. Do you think that is potentially related to land use differences across those regions? Or do you think it may be something else?
Certainly that would be my lead hypothesis. There are other things that could be happening there, but yeah, I think that's a good hypothesis. The coastal plain, because it has so much ag land, tends to have some weedier areas along those crop margins that may provide brood cover. The nesting cover is still pretty poor everywhere in the state. To me, portions of the Piedmont where they're actually managing with thinning and burning have maybe have some of the better nesting cover, but even there's a lot of closed canopy forest, so nesting cover is poor. Brood cover is largely absent on the landscape.
Yeah.
So, if a landowner asks me what should I do to benefit turkeys, I would say create nesting and brood cover, and especially brood cover. And brood cover is those herbaceous communities that we just tend to forget about on the landscape.
So is that? Let me just rehash what you just said. Your feeling on a lot of the landscape that it's not in low abundance. It's just frankly completely absent.
Well,
or nearly completely absent.
Nearly completely absent. Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe functionally absent.
Yeah. Well, so for some turkeys, it literally you may not have that little margin like you were talking about that could serve that role. So, yeah.
Yeah, and our hen turkeys certainly, when they have their broods, they go to those prototypical brooding areas. They go to maybe it's crop field margins, maybe it's a food plot that's fallow or that was managed purposefully usually probably for other reasons other than providing brood cover. It may be a little low creek, an area along a creek where you get some forb cover because the soils are rich and wet there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's always where there's that herbaceous cover.
Yeah.
And sometimes turkeys have to, they may have to move. The hen may have to move a distance with her brood to find those locations.
Yeah. Well, it seems like that problem has been pretty consistent across all the people we've talked to. In some of those studies, there's 3 of them that we have talked about. That I guess one's a thesis from South Carolina, and then a couple of other studies that we've talked to people involved in those that identified that single-digit proportion of the landscape. And it sounds like you may not have those actual numbers, but it sounds like you're in a pretty similar situation at least.
Oh yeah, yeah. You can just drive around and look for brood cover, and you'll be looking for a while.
Yeah.
So that first year we had very low brood cover, but in year 2, very low brood survival, 0.
Yeah.
And that's the 28 days. And year 2, it was 40%. And year 3, it was 30%. So
So how many
again,
hens was that?
there are these ups and downs
Yeah.
that are inexplicable in some ways.
How many hens was that, like, in that first year?
Well, there were 106 nests.
Okay, and you didn't see any broods? That that,
Well, we saw broods. So that was
no, I mean
16.
on the ones that you had tagged.
Oh, how many broods did we tag? Well, it was 16% of 106 nests survived. So then you can figure out what that is, and that's how many broods we started with
Yeah.
across the state.
So
I have that number, but not
yeah,
handy.
16% of nests, and then of
So it's
those
like
16.
16 broods. So of 16 broods, 0 survived.
Yeah.
Wow. So in the years where you did have some pulp production, Chris, and this may be too fine scale for you to recall, and if so, that's fine. But did you notice any sites that kind of broke the mold in terms of having much greater nesting success or brood survival?
Um, our students and technicians could say that. I don't. I'm not sure if there's that sort of consistency. We do see variation across our 3 regions, which is
Sure.
again unique for our project in that we can compare um, all these differences across the 3 regions, and certainly the timing was not different, but reproductive output did vary from one year to the next.
Mhm.
The first year in the coastal plain, um, let's see, I think I have this. The first year in our coastal plain, our nest success was 7%. 7%. So it was 25% in the mountains and 15% in the Piedmont. So that coastal plain nest success in the first year was abysmal,
Mhm.
which was surprising to us, given that the coastal plain turkey populations seem to be most robust in the state.
Mhm.
But the next 2 years, the coastal plain bounced back and had, in the second year, when everything sort of went really well, the coastal plain had the highest reproductive output.
Hmm.
So it's hard to predict because there's variability across the landscape, and there's also variability over time from one year to the next.
Sure.
What's really interesting is that um, we've talked to the researchers that have their big ongoing project in, in Tennessee. So these
Mhm.
are the research folks at the University of Tennessee, and they have a similar project to us in that it's large scale,
Mhm.
and they saw the same trends in 2020, 21, and 22 in the sense that their 2020 reproduction was near 0. And it was shocking to them. And it was shocking to us because it was the first year of our research project. And my first thought is like, oh my gosh, our research activities are, are having an impact. That's why it's
Mhm.
so low. They saw the same thing. So when we had our conversations, they had it gave them comfort to know that our numbers were the same as theirs. And so their numbers were low in 2020, and they had an incredible year in 2021, and same as us. So 2020 was the lowest, probably the lowest reproduction on record based on our state's hen poult ratios. 2021 was one of the highest. So you
Mhm.
see these ups and downs. What's interesting to me is why the consistency in these annual trends between North Carolina and Tennessee. What's happening? It seems potentially sort of this large sort of global effect that's
Mhm.
driving these ups and downs in reproduction.
Well, and it's even more consistent than that, Chris, because I think, Mississippi and Arkansas, at least, were tracking pretty close to one another, and I'm blanking on the data now. What I'm saying is, at least at latitudes, it seems to be pretty consistent across that latitude, and I can't remember how much it varies between, you know, latitudes, but
Well, that's why I think we need these collaborative multi-state studies so we can look at these sorts of big types of questions. Is
yeah.
it something consistent within latitude? Is it something consistent within the year? The
Mhm.
first thing that comes to mind to me and probably to y'all, if you think about these annual variations, what varies annually? Well, it's weather.
Mhm.
So, my first thought is it's weather. And I can tell you that we have an ongoing study that's funded by the Southeast um, Climate Adaptation Center to look at the effects of weather on wild turkey reproduction. And we're collaborating with Mike Chamberlain in Georgia and Brett Collier at LSU. So we have data from 5 states over 8 years.
Mhm.
And there's just not a lot of consistent connections between weather and turkey reproduction. So surprisingly to me, it's just not a real strong connection. And we're still working on that stuff, but it doesn't seem to be the answer to that question.
Yeah, the tough thing is speaking to someone that's tried to correlate various aspects of wildlife populations with weather before. That man, that can be a daunting task. I mean, you know, to our listeners, they probably think, oh well, you just look at rainfall levels and then you look at temperatures and things like that. But it's like at what time points and over what time period. There's a million different ways that you can possibly code these weather variables, and it's hard to know with any certainty which one is the correct. And by correct, I mean biologically significant, right?
You hit the nail on the head. The other sort of challenge is at what spatial scale. So
Mm-hmm.
ideally, we would want to be measuring the amount of precipitation, the temperature, right at the nest.
Yeah.
But that data is not available. You do the best you can, and the data that's available is at a 4-kilometer scale. So that's coarse. So that certainly could be a criticism of this sort of research, is that we're just not measuring the right scales, whether it's time or space.
Yeah, but
And maybe we'll get there.
But we're also seeing consistent patterns, at least in the latitude, across a huge scale.
Right.
So maybe you could just as easily be not be measuring it at a large enough scale.
Yeah,
I guess is what I'm saying.
That's a good point.
So what else do y'all have planned for this study, Chris? Where y'all headed from here?
So what we're going to be looking at adult female survival or female survival and the sort of causes of mortality. We're looking at male survival. That's something that state's really interested in. They're interested in the rates of hunter harvest, and they're also interested in other causes of mortality. And I can tell you that just some preliminary data, our male harvest across our regions varied among years and regions, and it varied from about 9% of the adult males were harvested to 43% in one region in 1 year. There are some sort of standards where you want to, you don't want to exceed certain percentages of the male harvest. And I think generally our study showed that in North Carolina, where we were doing our study on private lands, harvest was lower than that sort of threshold.
Yeah, that's actually pretty encouraging because, I mean, Marcus and I have just recently been talking about how we have this lack of data on male harvest rates, and that's something that I'm trying to get at right now here in Alabama as well, especially from private land. Yep.
Yeah, particularly on private land.
Right. A lot of the data is on public lands, and I think those numbers may be higher than on private lands. You may think not, and who knows? I think it varies with the private lands. So in our Piedmont region, harvest rates tended to be greater, and again, those properties in the Piedmont region are closer to large or denser human populations, but also those properties are managed more purposefully to provide hunting opportunities. So the coast and the mountains are working landscapes, and hunting often is a byproduct of what goes on there. Where in the Piedmont, hunting is a main purpose. I'll also tell you that adult males, the major source of mortality for adult male turkeys is hunter harvest. So, somebody once told me that they don't die otherwise. They do die otherwise, but the main reason they die is from hunter harvest. The last thing that was interesting to me related to male harvest is that we had, up to 25% of our male population of tag birds were jakes, and we had almost no jakes harvested. 1 or 2 over 3 years of the study.
Yeah.
So these private landowners are not shooting jakes.
Yeah. That's really interesting because, I've talked to a lot of our listeners who have asked me about, whether or not bans on jake harvest would potentially help, with populations and carrying over birds to enter that adult population the following year. But my experience has been that hunters are really voluntarily restricting themselves when it comes to jake harvest. For example, last year in my Alabama project, we were collecting hunter harvested carcasses from across the state. We had over 400 carcasses submitted to us, and I think we had like 3 or 4 jakes out of that total sample. And so there may be some bias there with hunters harvesting jakes, maybe not wanting to submit that sample that's biasing it a bit. But overall, I think it is pretty indicative that it's not a common occurrence.
Yeah, no, not in North Carolina.
Yeah, that's interesting. But what about the hen survival, Chris? I was going to ask you about that.
Well, that work is ongoing, so I don't really have any preliminary results with that. Um, as you might expect, a lot of hens die. There's certainly, I think our results are going to tell us that they're most susceptible to predation during nesting and brooding. That's a standard thing we
Mm-hmm.
would expect with wild turkeys. So those hens are super vulnerable to mortality when they're sitting on a nest or when they're with a brood.
Mm-hmm.
But we had turkeys die, throughout the year. So we're going to look at mortality during different um, uh, behavior periods. So whether they're more or less likely to die during certain times of the year based on their behaviors, are they reproducing? I mean, are they on the nest or they have broods? Um, and also based on landscape factors, the conditions in the landscape around the hen affect her potential to die, and that could be a surrogate for predator populations or predator densities. We'll look for regional variation and annual variation, those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
The one last big component of our study, and we weren't initially tasked to do the analysis for this, but what we were tasked to do was to collect health samples from every one of the birds that we caught. So the state really saw this as an opportunity with our hands on so many birds to collect just about every sort of health sample we could collect. So we collected cloacal swabs, we collected oropharyngeal swabs, is when you swab the inside of their mouth. We collected any sort of ectoparasites that would be present. We collected blood samples as best we could when we were able to. Sampling blood takes time, and if you have to move really quickly, sometimes blood got passed over. We also collected fresh feces with the idea to look for salmonella. And so with that, we're partnering. We in the state of North Carolina are partnering with the Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study at University of Georgia to look for turkey coronavirus, LPDV, REV, avian influenza, West Nile virus, and toxoplasma, among some other things that I probably don't even know about.
Mm-hmm.
That's not part of our study, but right now we're working with Squidis at Georgia and the state of North Carolina to generate a new grant that will allow us to look at documenting the prevalence of those diseases across the state, to look if there are regional differences in that disease prevalence, to look if there are potential landscape factors that are related or may be causing those variations in disease prevalence. And then hopefully the sort of gold standard would be to look to see if occurrence of disease, especially in females, has any relationship to their sort of life history, whether or not they reproduce. Their nests are more or less likely to be successful, if they survive better or worse over the long term, and if maybe they're more or less likely to bring off a brood. Because that's something we don't know in the turkey world. That's really something we're lacking, is how does disease
Mm-hmm.
prevalence affect those life history traits and the ability of the birds to survive and reproduce. We
Mm-hmm.
know that, hey, 50% of birds have antibodies for this or that, but we don't know what that means in terms of their ability to survive and reproduce.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's going to be super useful data. I
Yeah.
look forward to seeing those results.
Me
Yeah,
too.
absolutely. Uh, well, Chris, I think that was a really great overview. D- are there any other aspects or take-home messages from this project that you have already? I know it's still ongoing, and we'd love to have you back to talk about these things as they get more certain and you're publishing the work. But are there any other things about the studies that you want to highlight now, or that
No,
are
I
kind of
think the
take
take home
home?
message is that the timing of reproduction did not vary across the state. Um,
Yeah. What was the
reproduction varies from one year to the next. It does vary among our regions.
yeah.
It can be good, it can be bad, and certainly that affects the state of the population. So if you have a really poor reproductive year, next year you're not going to have many Jennies and Jakes,
Mm-hmm.
and then a year after that you're not going to have many older
Yeah.
male turkeys because the reproduction 2 years prior. I mean, you're going to have very few 2-year-old birds, which in most states that's the majority of the harvest.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So these things are interesting in the sense that they do affect long-term hunting opportunities for hunters.
Well, and it's kind of interesting too how they interact because they're offset, different
Right,
indicators. They're
right.
offset, which kind of confuses our vision of what's actually going on in a population. That's really interesting.
I
Uh,
think that's really interesting, and I think there could be something to that is affecting these population cycles, in that the sense you see
Yeah.
this cycle because it takes 2 years after a poor reproductive year to have
Mm-hmm.
fewer adult birds, or it takes 2 years after a good year to have more adult birds.
Right.
Mhm.
And that may be causing these sort of ups and downs in what we see in
Yeah, that's really
certainly in hunter
interesting.
harvest, but also potentially these other um, life history traits.
So that is really interesting, Chris. One thing that you did remind me, I wanted to ask you a specific question. What was the peak of nesting that you observed?
So our peak incubation across the state was around April 20th to 25th.
Okay.
So if you back that up, incubation's probably starting 2 weeks before that. So incubation, these are peaks. So these are
Mm-hmm.
the peaks. Um,
Yeah, like the middle of
incubation
it.
is sort of peaking in that first week of April. The beginning of no, egg laying is peaking that first week of April, and incubation is peaking in later in April.
Okay. Yeah. Good stuff. Well, Will, you got any other questions about that?
No, we covered everything that I had.
Well, Chris, like I've told you, and Will and I talk about, one of the purposes of the podcast is to connect the listeners with the work that's ongoing in their own states and closer to real time. So thanks for taking some time to tell us about all this great work that you're doing with all these partners. It's really encouraging to see that work getting accomplished, especially in your case on private land. That's really awesome. So thanks for taking the time, and we'd love to have you back to kind of update us as things progress through it. But thank you for taking the time to tell us about all this.
Thanks for having me, and I'd love to come back.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.